Hey, welcome back, Primetimers. It's Dominic, the Primetime Treasure Hunter. Some of you may be wondering where the part 2 is of the 1,000 plus comic book haul video that I posted yesterday. I am going to do a part 2. Thank you very much for your feedback and comments. I'm just going to wait a few days to do it because I have a few other projects and things to do in the meantime, but then I will shoot part 2 of that video. Now, if you did not get a chance to see it, it's right down here to the left. You can see it. It says 1,000 plus comic book haul video. I'll also post a link to it at the end of this video. So go check it out if you didn't get a chance to see it. I talked to you in that video about certain comic book titles that you need to be on the lookout for. I talked to you about how to process these collections once you've obtained it. I did mention the ad that I responded to that led me to source this collection, and I was gonna take you through it in that video, but it just didn't flow right, and I felt that it would be better to actually pull it out and do a separate video that was purely dedicated to some things to look for when you're going through these ads online about comic book collections, because I get a lot of questions on how to get started in comic books, and one of the things I tell people is, it's important to find a small collection or relatively small collection to pick up. So one in the hundreds, probably max would be around 1,000 comics to pick up, and see how well you could do with flipping it. Now, you have to be able to get it at a good price, and that's the problem, because a lot of times the ads for comic book collections, the people who are trying to sell them are asking for astronomical prices from a reseller's perspective. The prices might be okay if you're a collector and you're looking to pick up these books, but you have to remember, you're not trying to pick them up as a collector. You're trying to pick them up so you have margin that you could flip it and make a nice profit. And for that, you generally need to be at between 10 and 20 cents per comic. Average would be about 15 cents. You could go higher than that if you have good knowledge about what's actually in those boxes. But as a starting point, that's where you want to be. So it really becomes a pure numbers game. That's why when I found out that that comic book collection yesterday had 1,000 comics, I offered $125 because that's 12.5 cents per book, and it leads me to have a little bit of room to negotiate upwards if she were to have come back and said, no, that's not good enough, I need to have, $250 or something like that. Then I could negotiate a bit. But turns out she didn't say that, and she just accepted the $125, so we move forwards. And I'm going to actually take you through that ad in a few moments. Let me take you over to Craigslist itself, and you can see here, actually, this ad is one that I actually post myself. So I actually have an ad where I am looking for comic books. So I'm trying to find others to respond directly to me so I could just deal with them one-on-one. Because the problem is, if you're responding to someone else's ad, chances are, especially when it has to deal with comic books, that you're not the only one writing that person, and now you're competing with a bunch of other people that are trying to get the same collection that you are. So I've done a separate video. Look for the video I did on sourcing in the winter time. Just search for that on my channel, and you will see I actually take you through this ad and some other ones that I use for sourcing, and so you can see the different components of that. But this video is specifically designed for looking for ads that other people post. And this is actually the one down here I responded to. I'll take you through it in a few moments, but let me show you a few things about Craigslist. One is, you can see here I typed in comics. Now, just so you know, I type this in and search for it every day, multiple times. Now, you could set up alerts, and I get alerts, but still, there could be a time where the alert doesn't come in immediately and I might miss something. So I'm always just going through and checking it every day, a few times a day. And I not only look for the word comics, but I also type in comic, because look at the difference. When you type in comic, it brings up different ads. It will bring up some of the same ads, but if the person who put an ad about comics with an S never wrote the word comic in it, it won't show up. Same thing with if someone wrote comic but never wrote comics, then it won't show up when you search for comics. So you have to make sure that you put the S in and you also search for it in the singular form. So you have to search for it both ways. To me, it's a silly feature of Craigslist, and that doesn't apply to other places, but where you would search for things online. But for Craigslist, it's very specific. So make sure you look at it in terms of both ways. Another thing I like to search for is the word collection, but chances are that if someone's selling a comic book collection, they will have used the word comic or comics somewhere there. But collection is another good term to look for on Craigslist to source all sorts of other cool collections. Now, look here. This is an example of something to avoid. You can see here, this one is 14 war stories, GI Combat, and other 1960s comic books. And the first thing that jumps out to me is that these comic books have wear on them. So if you look here, and we'll make it a little bit bigger, you see here on the side it has wear on it. It has these white spots. It has cracks in it, creases, fading of color, which to some degree is to be expected. It has some writing on the top, which I explained yesterday doesn't take away from the value too much, but ideally you'd prefer it not to be there rather than it be there. At least most people would. So that's one thing that stands out to me as sort of an issue, and that I want to avoid high prices because there is some wear on these books. And not only that, if you look at some of the other ones, there's even more wear that shows up. So if we look at this one here, this GI Combat one, you could see there's really a lot of spine wear on this. There's blunting of the corners down below. There's creases on the pages. I could see one right here going down. You might not be able to see it, but it's a crease that breaks color. Whenever you have creases that break color, that's more of a problem than creases that don't break color, like a more of a subtle crease. So all this tells me that this is going to bring down value in terms of the books. And when I look at the price here is very concerning. The person is asking $210 for these books. Couple other things that are concerning about the post for me as a collector and a reseller is you see the degree of specificity that the person put in their comic book listing. So this person is a collector. And, because this person's putting everything in. They're putting in the year, they're putting in the month, they're putting in the volume, they're putting down the publisher, all this stuff. So, and they're taking pictures of each individual comic book. So chances are this is someone who knows something about comic books. But the price is just out of this world, and you'll never be able to flip this and make a profit if you purchase this for $210. If you want proof of that, all you have to do is go to eBay and search the completed sold, and you'll see here that in auction format, 15 GI Combat comic books, and these would be from the 1960s, sold for $83 plus $8.95 shipping. So, half of the price, or more than half of the price of this over here for $210. You are never going to make your money back on a collection like this. So you need to avoid something like that. Here's another example. Someone in Liverpool, New York, which isn't too far from me, is offering 50 comic books, mostly from the 70s to 80s and early 2000s, for $150. That's not good. That's $3 per comic book. And they're not even that old. I mean, 70s and 80s is good. You'd like to get books from the 70s and 80s, but there's also ones from the 2000s in there, which also mean there's going to be ones from the 90s in there. So it's not a pure 70s to 80s collection, and there's only 50 of them. You cannot be paying $3 a comic book unless you are getting all comic books that were worth, $30, $40, $50 a piece. It just doesn't make any sense, and that's not the case with most comic book collections. I don't know if Thrifty Esme's watching this. She might want the 25 Star Trek series VHS tapes. Go follow Thrifty Esme, by the way. Thrifty and then ESME. She's great, and go check her out. She's got a new channel. It's really cool. So check it out. Now, getting back to what we're talking about here. So that's something to avoid. You don't want to pay $3 per comic book. Remember, you want to be down to 10 to 20 cents per book. So Let's go down and we'll look some more, and we will then see some other people who are advertising. See, this is my competition. These are people who are also trying to buy comic book collections. So I've got to compete with that. And then we see the ad I responded to yesterday. So I'm sitting there in my son's basketball gym in the game. You know, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, and actually it was earlier than that. It was 7:30. The game started at 8. And I go on my Craigslist app. That's another thing to point out. Make sure you get the Craigslist app, download it, and you could do your searches on there and get notifications set up. And I search and I see this. I just typed in comics. This came up and I look at it. Now, this initially appealed to me a bit because it says Transformers, and Transformers, very popular, great 80s toy line, a comic book sell. So I said, okay, that's interesting. Has Transformers on there, but I'm not immediately seeing like a ton of books or anything. So I read a little bit further, and this is what caught my eye. So, comic book collectors, do I have a pot of gold for you? Well, if you're the primetime treasure hunter and you hear about a pot of gold, that is going to make my ears go up, and I am listening and want to read some more and see what this person has to offer. So, it says, I have 3 huge totes and a bag full of original comics. So right there, stop the presses, okay? That is telling me something huge, and if you're brand new into comics, you might not know what I'm talking about, and you can see it in one of the photos. I'm going to move it over here. So here's the clear tote that, if you watched my video yesterday, I now have in my possession. And here's these Venom comic books, which also jumped out at me. Venom, hugely popular character, always sells well. Guaranteed you will sell Venom if you buy Venom. So I said, wow, now I'm really interested. But the thing that jumped out at me was the comic books are being stored in totes, and they are being stored in a bag. Okay, listen very clearly to this. Comic book collectors do not keep their comic books in totes, and they don't keep them in a bag. They keep them in comic book long boxes like this. And this was this is just something I took off the internet, but a long box like this is what I had yesterday in my video, where I was putting the comics I was processing so I could organize them and look through them better vertically. So you put them in these long boxes or short boxes, but you do not keep them in totes. The people who keep comic books in totes are people who don't collect them, but they source them from somewhere else. So they source them from either an auction, or they pick them up through a storage unit haul, or maybe they got them at an estate sale and they were just looking for some place to kind of toss the comic books, so they tossed them in a tote. But the point is, the person who owns a comic book collection and has them in totes, very, very, very high probability that this person is not a collector and just obtained them and doesn't know a lot about comic books. And that's very important. When you are sourcing comic books, ideally, you'd like to get them from someone who doesn't know anything about them, so that you could maximize the chance you're going to get a good deal. Now, don't get me wrong. I do buy comic book collections from collectors, but those situations only tend to work out when the person really is just fed up with their collection, wants to move on with it. Their spouse is bothering them that it takes up too much time and they just want to liquidate it, or they really need cash. So that's how you're going to do well with a collector. But when you're dealing with a non-collector, you really have a good chance to pick up some gems that the collector would have known and maybe would have picked out already. So this is a good opportunity to get books like this. Like, as an example, I'm talking about, if you remember the video I showed you yesterday, I was looking for that Marvel Age 41. Well, a collector may sell you a big lot of comic books, but pull out that Stan Lee cover because they know that one's valuable. Whereas someone who's not a collector, who's keeping things in totes like this, would never do that. And sure enough, that's one of the reasons we were able to find that Marvel Age 41 in there. No one picked it out. So that's a big thing that jumped out at me. Now, the person says most are in plastic sleeves, and there are hundreds of them. So a couple things that jump out to me there, and this is just based on my experience of buying collections in totes. literally, it is correct that there are hundreds of them, but the chances are if there's 3 huge totes, and it turns out that she actually combined 2 of these totes together into one. That's why you saw me yesterday with 2 huge totes and a big bag that had a box within it. That's why that happened. But chances are the person is undercounting comics, and I see this happen all the time. It's accidental, but people are really bad at estimating how many comic books are in a collection. And so I had a feeling there were probably more in there than like 200 to 300, which is another reason that made me reach out. Another good sign is most of them were in plastic sleeves. Now, one of the things I had to explain to this person on the phone, because when I was getting some more information about the books, she's telling me, well, they're all in perfect condition, and that's because they are in bags. And that's another red flag. I'm dealing with somebody who doesn't know about comic books, because if you know about comic books, you know that comic books could be in sleeves, plastic sleeves, and they could still have damage to them. That doesn't make them immune from getting damage, or it doesn't make them immune from sustaining damage outside of the sleeve and then someone just putting it in a sleeve. So it's just funny to me how people who don't deal in comics think that because they're in sleeves, they're in perfect shape. So I had to make sure she knew that, because I wanted to immediately take that away from her as leverage that I think she may have thought she had in the negotiation. Maybe she didn't, but I wanted to make sure I took that away, because I wanted her to know that there's really no collection that I purchased like this that doesn't have some books in there that are damaged. You have to assume that going in, by the way. You have to account for that if you're buying all these books, there's gonna be a percentage of them, hopefully a small percent, hopefully you can keep it under 10%, 5% that have damage, and so you can't use them. Like I said yesterday, there's other ways you could repurpose those books. I wouldn't necessarily toss them, but if you're artistic or creative, you could repurpose those books that have damage to them. Now, another thing that jumped out to me, years ranging from the 1970s all the way to 1999. So what I'm thinking to myself here is that if this person does not know comic books, which is my hypothesis going into this, another thing I've noticed in people who sell these collections is that they also basically underestimate how old the books are. So they think that the books are from the 1970s, but they don't realize that there's ones in there from the 60s and sometimes even the 50s. And yesterday, there were a bunch of books that were 12-cent issues, from the 1960s or early 1960s. So that's a good example of what I'm talking about, that, when you get these collections, sometimes there's older books in there than what the person advertised them. So don't think if a person just says 70s or 80s that there's nothing in there earlier than that. There may very well be. The person just might not know because they're not into collecting. Now, she chose in her ad to put a lot of Venom up. You could see Venom there. She put up, now, this is another great example of how I know this person doesn't know comic books. The person is putting up a picture of Spider-Man, which is good because the person thinks that Spider-Man is valuable, and Spider-Man is valuable. The problem is Spider-Man really isn't valuable when it's on the cover of Marvel Age, because as I explained yesterday, Marvel Age is really just a promotional comic book that Marvel put out to advertise their comics, and most of the issues really just don't have much value unless you combine them together. There's a few exceptions, like the Stan Lee cover that I showed you yesterday, but for most of them, they're not really worth anything, and this is a good example of it. So, but the person puts this up there because the person thinks, oh, well, here's Spider-Man, so I'll show you Spider-Man, and you'll think that I have valuable comics. But doesn't work that way. But, if you know these kind of ins and outs like I'm explaining to you, these are all things that can lead you to say, this might be a really good pickup. Person puts up the Punisher. Punisher, actually, the series just got canceled on Netflix. I saw that yesterday. But I love the Punisher. And the Punisher does have a loyal following. So I like seeing old Punisher books. They're not worth a ton, but they still have value. And the Transformers. So all those things jumped out at me. And you can see here she's putting in some different titles. She misspelled Venom. But you put a lot of other things in there. So another thing that is interesting to me about this post, right, that you don't see, what is it that we do not see? We don't see a price. So there's no immediate turnoff there in terms of, oh, well, the person is asking for $1,000 or or $500 or something like that. So it sounds to me when I see this, this is open to negotiation, which is perfect. So now I have my opportunity. I can move in. I contact the person. I ask if they're available. She says they are. I ask her how much she wants for them. She says she's not sure for me to give her a number. I said, I'll do that. I just need to know how many there are. She tells me there's about 1,000 of them. And then for me, it's a pure numbers game. Okay, you have to remember that. It's numbers, numbers, numbers. Now, you could offer the 125, like I told you, because that would get you to about 12.5 cents. And like I said, you could negotiate upwards a bit depending on what's in there. What I'll do in some situations, if the person, let's say the person's asking me for a 200 and they're not flexible on that, and the max I really want to go is 150. Now, I may be willing to go up to 200, 20 cents per buck, but I really got to be convinced there's something in there. So if the person's stuck at 200, I've had this happen before. Person's stuck at 200, I'm at 150. That's the max I'm going to come up to. What I'll say in that situation is, all right, I'll tell you what. You're 200, I'm at 150. How about I just come over there, I'll look through the books, and I'll see what's there and see if we could then make a deal in person. Because once you're there and you see the collection for yourself, you have a better sense if it's something you want to pay up a little bit more for. But what I use that opportunity for is then to negotiate in person, and I'd either get it down to 175, or what I've done before is I'll say to the person, do you have anything else here that you want to sell? And a lot of times they do, and so I'll get things added on to the comic collection, and I'll pay the 200, but I'll pay the 200 for getting a bunch of additional stuff beyond the original comic collection. So, which is good, because if the person wanted originally 200 for just the comics and you could get the comics plus a whole bunch of other collectibles, then that could be even a better deal for you. So that's how I go about doing it. It's obviously just an example, and Craigslist is just one place I go to look. Again, there's lots of other places like OfferUp and LetGo and Auction Zip and Facebook Marketplace. There's lots of places to go and look for these types of things, but these same general principles apply no matter where you're looking. So if you have questions that I didn't address, make sure that you let me know that in the comment section. I will get back to you as soon as I can. I like to interact with all of you. Any comments, put those down below. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel if you're not a subscriber. I would love to see you subscribe. We're trying to get to 5,000 subs by the end of the year, so we're hopefully on track to get that. We're close to 3,000, so that's exciting to move into that level hopefully pretty soon. Come by my Facebook group, the Facebook Reselling Resource Center. The link to that is down below. And also come by and check me out on Instagram. That's at prime_time_treasure. I try to do a live show with people once a week for about a half hour, usually on Mondays, but sometimes other nights, like I did that last night. And we just get to talk. If you want to come by, go on a screen with me and chat, we could do that too. So lots of different ways to interact, and I look forward to doing a lot more of that with you this year. So with that, I've got some other things to tend to. Gonna edit this video, get it up, and talk to y'all later. Hope you enjoyed it. Take care, everyone.